fellow drawers, how's it going? Are you feeling fun? Well, it's no fun for you today, because today we take a break from all the jokes and foolery and get into some serious learning, because that's what adults do. So in this video, I'm going to show you a simple guide to how I personally draw bodies, step by step. The general tips and things to keep in mind when building your character. This is a guide for basic anatomy, which means I'm not going to go in depth about any of the muscles and details of the body, because that is a whole other complex topic that needs its separate video. I'm going to talk about the basic structure, basic shapes, and rules and proportions. This is what my style looks like, this is how I draw my characters, and this is the result that we're gonna try to get to by the end of today's class. I had to do a lot of drawing for this video, a lot of different pose examples for you. Mind you that any tutorial is subjective and I will be going off of my stylistic choices and preferences. There can be a million ways to draw bodies and there is no ultimately correct or incorrect way to do it. You do you, and if something works with your style, great. But I am making this tutorial based on my personal experience and the mistakes that I have made, and what I consider right or wrong can be subjective. I've spent a long time making this tutorial, trying to make it as simple and as understandable as possible, so if you end up finding it helpful, then consider leaving a like because it really helps the algorithm and I really appreciate it. With that said, let's get started. I will be breaking every body part into simple shapes that I feel like make it easier to draw that body part from different angles. Every body part that I will go through will consist of lines, big shapes, small shapes, and details. So whenever I start sketching out a pose, the first thing I do is I mark the shoulder line and the hip line. This way I can estimate the size of my character's torso to make sure I have enough space and that it is positioned in a right way on the canvas. These lines can tilt in different directions depending on the pose. Normally I want them to be tilted at different angles, something like this. It makes the pose look more dynamic, but here I'm just going to do it with a symmetry tool to save myself some time. Then you can also mark the middle line between these lines. It can help you with keeping the proportions correct, and you can also connect these two lines with a line that kind of represents the spine of your character, which can bend depending on the pose and can also serve as a symmetry line for your shapes. But I don't do that too often, I usually just go right into drawing the shapes. Next, I represent the two halves of the body as these two trapezoid shapes. I don't know, call them whatever you want, whatever association you have. This is just what I found works for me. I've seen people use all sorts of shapes from boxes to ellipses to triangles. I think it's just a matter of preference. I found that these shapes make more sense to me personally. Now, the top shape is supposed to represent the shoulders with the rib cage. I often do this to make it look more like ribs. I don't know, for some reason it makes it easier in my opinion. And the bottom one is the pelvis, so it starts at the waist and ends at the end of the groin. These two shapes are obviously not flat. Just like our bodies, they are 3D and will look something like this when you start rotating the body. They can vary in sizes depending on the body type that you're trying to achieve, so you can make wider hips and narrower shoulders, or wider shoulders and narrower hips, whatever you feel like works with your character. For these shapes to make more sense to you, I suggest you take some time, find some pictures on Pinterest of people in different poses, and just try to find and outline these shapes in those poses. Just draw over them. See what those shapes actually represent and how they look from different angles. That will literally take you like 10 minutes, but that will help your brain tremendously to understand why you're drawing these shapes. Especially if you're a total beginner, I highly suggest you spend some time learning how to draw your basic shapes from different angles and perspective. Draw this line in the middle, this symmetry line. Move away from your canvas, squint your eyes, look at it. If you're drawing digitally, zoom out. Flip your canvas horizontally back and forth. Is it even? Is it symmetrical? Does it look right? Train your brain to see symmetry, to feel that balance. I understand that most of us as beginners, we just want to draw all those cool designs and sick poses, so we often rush through these first steps to get to the fun part. Trust me, I know. But it's not gonna look cool if the base structure is wrong. If this carcass is all wonky and uneven, everything you will try to build on top of it will also look wonky and uneven. If you screwed up the first step, all the further steps are going to crumble. So please spend enough time on this first step and make sure it looks right before going further. After the big shapes, we have our smaller shapes and details. The order that we will go in is neck, torso, arms, and legs. Okay, sounds good? Let's figure out the neck, because this is the part that most beginner artists don't know how to draw, how to connect the head to the body. So you often see something like this going on, where the neck and the shoulders form this Roblox-esque 90-degree angle, which obviously looks super weird and unnatural because we as humans don't want our necks to suddenly break when we tilt our head sideways, and that's why we have muscles that support our neck and give it flexibility. So all you have to do is just add these muscles here. Boom. That's it. Now it's a person. These muscles can be more or less prominent depending on how much fat and muscle mass your character has. If you're drawing a big muscular hunk of a character, then make sure you really emphasize their neck. It's crucial to the way the character looks. A big character with a thin neck will look extremely weird, as well as a skinny character with a thick neck. So don't underestimate the neck. Now let's move on to the torso. Let's start with the waist. To make a waist, you basically connect these two shapes with somewhat straight lines. The bigger your character's body is, the wider these trapezoids should get, and therefore the waist will also get wider. Now, the more empty space we have within a big shape, the more likely we are to make some mistakes there. So I always try to fill in that space as much as I can, to give myself as many guidelines as possible. So the first one for me is this rib line. It's super helpful. Then starting from this rib line, I can draw this oval for the tummy. Then I imagine like I'm putting the high waist panties on my character. This helps you define this bump over here, because even though in more simplified art styles the body can look like this with one big curve for the hip, but we actually kind of have two curves, so instead of one polygon we get two polygons. Then here I make these tank top lines. With these lines I kind of separate the shoulders from the chest. It's not necessary, but I always do it and I find it really helpful. Next I draw a horizontal line for the chest to make sure the titties are on the same level, and then I draw this boxy outline for the breasts themselves. And now having all these guidelines, I feel a bit safer. I feel like I have something to rely on. So now we can add all of our details like collarbones here, make the breasts less edgy, and see that the breasts don't normally sit right next to each other. They only do that when they're squished by something, but when they're not, they're just two guys chilling in a hot tub, 5 feet apart because they're not. You can add your belly button, you can add these fun little side abs muscles. I feel like they look cute. We connect our ribs here and add some armpits. And yeah, I think that's a nice looking torso. I think we did a great job. Now it's time to add some limbs. Now let's talk about the arms. I'm not going to touch on hands here because I have a full hand tutorial that you can watch. Let's just talk about the arms. The biggest mistake that I was making as a beginner and that I see a lot of people make is literally forgetting that joints exist and that joints are actually the widest points of our limbs and not the narrowest. See these bones? They are super thin. They are so thin. And look at the joints. They are wider because they have a whole mechanism in them. And the more you bend your arm, the wider this elbow part gets. So with that in mind, let's draw an arm step by step. Whenever I'm sketching out the arms, I just use some sticks to pose them first, and then I add the circles for the joints, and then I start building up the meat on top of that. So you can start by marking the direction of your arms with straight lines, but obviously you need to keep in mind some proportions when you do that. First thing you should remember is that the shoulder joints should stay somewhat inside this shape, not outside. So this shape already represents the entire width of the shoulders. So I draw a circle where the shoulder joint would be. Then here, approximately where your character's waistline is where our second joint would be, okay? That is the elbow joint. And our third circle is right here where the torso ends. That is the wrist joint. A very important thing to remember when you're drawing these sticks and circles is that the upper arm and the forearm should be about the same length. Please pay attention to that, because even if you make your arms too short or too long as their proportions are correct, they're not gonna look as bad. So here we have the three joints of our arms: the shoulder, the elbow, and the wrist, and that is a solid base. We are done posing our arms, and let's move on to adding some meat. To draw the upper arm, I usually represent it as a long cylinder. For now it's just cylinders and circles, and the forearm is a long cylinder that is a bit wider on top. See? Here. And the hands, we're not talking about hands today, so let's just represent them like this. When you draw arms in perspective, these cylinder shapes are especially helpful because it is easier to imagine a cylinder in perspective rather than some weird arm shape. And then you can connect all of these shapes, round up the shoulder, the elbow, then the wrist, and Okay, now let's go over some muscle details and break down the arms into smaller sections because they're just made of these chunks that perfectly connect to each other and everything somehow makes sense. This is kind of what it looks like. This is simplified, of course. I associate it with a chain or a braid, maybe, because you see this shape goes in between these shapes and these shapes go in between these shapes and they all kind of blend into each other and connect. Of course, the visibility of these shapes depends on the musculature of your character. If your character is not very muscular and not very dry, then their arms will look very smooth, just like mine do. See, there is no muscle definition whatsoever, but the more yoked your character is, the bigger and more defined these muscles are gonna get. Also, a small tip when drawing the elbow when the arm is bended, some people tend to do something like this. Just draw this sharp pointy thing. First of all, our elbows are not nearly as sharp, but the way some people draw it, those elbows could kill a man. And secondly, in reality, we have three bones that connect in our elbow. So when you look at it from the side, this is what it's gonna look like. Here are the 2 points, and they kind of make this flat part. I don't know how to explain it better, but I think you see it. And another small but significant detail is the wrist joints. I remember I used to constantly draw hands like this, making the wrist really narrow, but the wrist is pretty wide. The wrist joints form these two little bumps on both sides. The one from the pinky finger side is particularly prominent. You can really see it really stands out. Now for the legs, the formula for drawing legs is very similar to drawing arms. First, I would suggest you mark the entire length of the legs to the ankles, so without feet. We're not going to talk feet today. And that distance will be somewhat equal to the distance from the top of the head to the end of the torso. Okay? It can differ, of course, but let's just say that. And now you can mark the halfway point as well, because just like our arms, the two halves of our legs should be about the same length. And you start with 3 circles for the joints: the hip, the knee, and the ankle joint. So after the circles are in place, we can connect them with middle lines, so we have something to visually rely on when drawing the meat. So I always use these lines and circles to pose the legs, same as I did with the arms. Then you draw some cylinders to estimate the width that you want for your legs. You can make them wider or thinner, that's up to you, but don't make them too wide because we will be putting some more meat on top of them. And now let's figure out our muscle and joint placements. The biggest misconception I had as a beginner, besides not acknowledging the joint existence, is I thought that legs and arms as well are symmetrical, so that the muscles on the outer side of the leg mirror the muscles on the inner side. But that could not be further from the truth. In fact, none of the muscles in our legs are symmetrical. Our legs actually look super weird and crooked and have a lot of curves, but it is still very possible to make sense of it and memorize it all. So first, just remember that there are 3 curves on the outer side and 4 on the inner side, okay? Let's start with the outer side. The first curve is this big thigh curve. It starts from where our high waist panties end and ends somewhere here. It doesn't have to be exact, it just has to be a nice curve. Then it kind of goes straight, and then starting from about the center of the knee goes our second curve that looks like the thigh curve but just smaller. It's the calf curve. And the third curve is this small ankle joint bump. Here's the geometrical low poly version for your better understanding. Now let's figure out the inner side. As I said, we have 4 curves. The first one is the inner thigh, which looks like the outer thigh but smaller and is placed a bit lower. The second curve is the knee bump. It cuts off the inner thigh line and begins from this leg muscle that we got in our thigh. So here goes this line, wraps around the knee, and kind of goes back inside. Okay? The third curve is the inner calf. It's smaller than the outer calf and it's placed lower. And the last bump is the ankle joint again. So here's what we got. Here's the low poly version. I think low poly is easier to understand, so you can pause and look into it if you want. Now for some important tips. Most mistakes occur when we try to bend our limbs. Same as with arms, remember that we are not rag dolls. Watch out for the joint. Also, a big one is a sharp or just round kneecap. Our kneecaps are actually kind of square, so when you bend your leg, it does not form this just one pointy angle. It is very square looking actually, see? And you can see that when you bend your knees, they're flat on top. You can literally, I can put this dirty matcha glass on my knee, it will stand straight. And same as with wrists, our legs get wider at the ankles. So it kind of goes thinner, thinner, then straight, and then wider again. And here we have our legs. Beautiful. And that is pretty much it for this tutorial. I hope I managed to explain everything in an understandable way. But if you have any questions or any other thoughts, or maybe your own tips and tricks for drawing anatomy that can maybe help other people, then feel free to share those in the comments. I will try to reply when I can. And thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then press like, subscribe. I have other tutorials like this on my channel, as well as some fun stuff that you can watch. Or if you just want to look at the art that I make, then you can check it out on Instagram, Kara, or here in YouTube Shorts. And good night, good day, goodbye. Oh my god, look at your anatomy. You have a chicken wing for an arm. Why is that? Why are you a chicken? Oh no.